So if you didn't know, Android's distribution numbers have been published and they are way better than they were back in the day, but we still have a lot of work to do to get better updates for all of our phones. So let's get into the numbers, let's get into what that means for you and hopefully for Android. If you're new around here though and you like deep dives into the state of Android and keeping up with the latest Google news, then come join the community and hit that subscribe button. It helps out more than you know. As I alluded to right at the start, Google has just recently updated Android's distribution numbers for early 2026, and while there are some promising signs, there are some lingering annoyances and similar complaints that we've had, or at least have been levelled at brands on this side of the fence for the better part of a decade. If you've been in the ecosystem for a while, which I hate using that term ecosystem, but if you've been on Android for a while, you know the drill. Google releases the source code, sadly not as fast as they used to do, Pixels get that update immediately, and everybody else joins the party when they can. But in 2026, with 7-year update promises being basically the new standard for top tier smartphones, you kind of would have expected these numbers to look a little bit more, well, dare I say it, Apple-esque. The thing is, that's not actually the case, but let's unpack the data first because the percentages tell a story of both progress and very, well, I guess frustrating tail end of life potentially for older phones and tablets, because yes, lest we forget that tablets actually account for some of this data. So Android 16, the latest release, it's in 2 parts, available on Pixel phones. It's technically been out since June 2025, the first portion of that, but it only now accounts for 7.5% of all active Android phones out there in the wild, the kind of phones you see running out there, out and about, devices that are being sold as of this video going live. This seems really low to me, especially given that hundreds of millions of phones are actually eligible for this update, or at least set to receive it as of today. The good news, Android 15 accounts for the biggest slice of the pie at 19.3%. I say good news because this suggests that while people aren't yet jumping on the absolute latest build, the previous version is finally achieving a bit of a healthy saturation point. It's possible that many owners are simply waiting for that notification to pop up rather than seeking out the update for themselves. So that's maybe why Android 15 is still quite a way ahead of Android 16 in that regard. What's more, loads of phones are actually still shipping with Android 15 pre-installed, which I don't think is a great look, but it is something important to note as well. Anecdotally, that does track. While Google did move the Android 16 release forward to Q2 to better align with hardware launches last year, many OEMs are still in the beta or testing phases with their own Android 16 builds. It also doesn't help that Android 16 QPR1 did cause some issues of its own. It is just another layer on top of that first release of Android 16, or that earlier than expected first launch, and it means a shortened dev cycle there across both updates. So that means that you've got a bigger update on top of another update, which has caught some Android makers off guard maybe. I mean, I'm only offering a potential explanation. I'm not defending the delays, I'm just, giving you an option or giving a bit of an explanation as to why that could be the case. Either way, Samsung, the biggest player on the board, started rolling out One UI 8 based upon that first version of Android 16 as far back as October 2025 for the S25 and the S24 series, but regional rollouts and carrier testing do often act as a bottleneck, as we all know, so that might be account for some of those devices still running Android 15 out there in the wild. Just behind Android 15 is Android 14, which has 17.2% of global installs, though through the lens of someone who actually uses the latest hardware, to me that feels a lot higher than it probably should do. But I guess Android 14, it isn't necessarily an old build per se, it's stable, it's a mature version of the OS, and I have to say I'd happily use Android 14 today without feeling like I'm drastically missing out on maybe more than a few AI bells and whistles, to be completely frank with you. That said, it seems a bit higher than it probably should be for a nearly 2-year-old Android build. Beyond this, I think, is where we start to get in the age-old fragmentation argument that has kind of plagued Android since its very beginning. Android 13 is still a double-digit update in terms of user share, which is potentially in the hundreds of millions. At 13.9%, that is a really massive number of people out there using a now 3-year-old release. And while it is a perfectly usable OS, it lacks some of the more nuanced privacy controls and background optimizations we've seen get added in the last couple of years. This is where a criticism of cheap hardware does come back into play, at least in my mind. Mid-range and budget devices still often only get 1 or maybe 2 platform updates if they're lucky. Then you're left kind of to languish on these older builds. I think that's a kind of a case in point with this version. Gets a little worse though, as the Android 12 user base is still at 11.4% and Android 11 at 13.7%. Double digits again for what feel like practically ancient releases now. One of them is 5 years old, so could you imagine someone out there still using iOS 14 on their iPhone day to day? Yeah, I don't think that would be the case unless that person is allergic to updating their phone, or they've got a really, really old phone and they can't seem to switch away from it. It's just really something that iPhone users probably don't have to deal with, although it's a confusing problem that we have here on Android. As for the rest, Android 10 is now dwindling to 7.8%, Android 9 is at 4.5%, and Android Oreo, yes, Android Oreo, the Android 8.1 version, is getting lower and lower and makes up around 3 to 4% of those base installs across all phones. Let's not get it twisted though. These figures are definitely a damn sight better than they have been in years prior, but there is still nuance here to consider. The biggest question I have is, why aren't we seeing a faster move to the latest version? I think there are a few factors at play here, and I don't think I'm really revealing anything too drastic here. You could argue that most casual users, the people who aren't watching tech videos like this, simply do not care about the version number their phone's running. They see a system update notification as a chore, as it's going to be 20 minutes, maybe even an hour in some cases, to potentially change their UI layout, ruin the experience. And if you're not tech literate, you might potentially avoid updating because you don't really want buttons moved around, you don't want to burden yourself with learning new things, and you don't want your font to change, all those kind of things. Another thing to consider here is that you need to think about all the Android devices that aren't phones, for instance. We're talking about tablets in restaurants, point-of-sale units, the kind of thing that you pay with your phone with, digital signage, and even car head units, things like that. These devices are often locked to a specific version of Android that was validated for their specific software. They don't need Android 16's new photo picker or AI wallpapers. They just need to run one app and run one app reliably, and they don't get updated on a very frequent or even regular basis. There's also the problem with heavy OEM skins, and while Samsung, the biggest player in this space, has become exponentially faster at pushing releases, other brands still struggle to port their heavy UI changes over to every new Android base release. Every time Google changes the underlying code, companies like Xiaomi, Honor, OnePlus and more have to ensure that their specific features that they built for their phones still work. That takes a long time, and software engineers have to make sure everything fits for the brand's specific requirements and feature sets, which adds more time to the potential that you have to wait for that release to be made available for your phone. Another thing we have to talk about is that 7-year update promise, which seems to be what felt a bit like the silver bullet to this problem. Both Google and Samsung have been shouting from the rooftops about supporting their latest flagships like the Pixel series and the Galaxy S25 and S24, even some of the older ones, well into the 2030s. While I think it's a fantastic PR move, on paper, it's exactly what the ecosystem does need to combat the e-waste narrative and the fact that we don't get these updates. There is a major catch though. These promises only apply to the cream of the crop, the $700-800 plus devices. So if you're buying a $200 budget phone today, you're likely stuck with just a 2-year update cycle potentially, and it gets even worse depending on the brand that you're looking at. This creates a massive update class system where the gap between the haves and the have-nots is basically widening year over year, and while the 7.5% adoption for Android 16 is an improvement over the previous years, it's driven almost entirely by these high-end devices, while the rest of the market does kind of drag down the average. So while I will say the OS numbers look a bit messy, there is a secret weapon Google has been using over the past few years called Project Mainline. And if you're not aware of this, this was introduced back in Android 10. This effectively modularized, I can't even say that properly, the OS itself, and it allows Google to update critical system components like security, media codecs, and even new features like the photo picker directly through the Google Play Store. As of Android 16's release, there are now over 50 modules here, and this is why your 3-year-old phone might actually feel a little bit more modern and secure than its actual Android version lets on, even if it says 13 or 14 in there. Google is essentially trying to bypass the OEMs and carriers to keep your phone alive in the background, as it were. It doesn't fix a distribution pie chart, but it definitely makes a fragmentation problem much less of an issue, much less dangerous than it was a decade ago. We also have to consider the timing of this data. Early 2026 is kind of a transitional period. Most major Android 16 rollouts are for mid-range devices, and older flagship devices are actually scheduled for Q2 of this year. Yes, that is a long time, but it does mean that 7.5% number is essentially, I'm going to class it as a day one crowd of early adopters. Most of us are probably Pixel users anyway, but that 7.5% does probably account for a lot of the high end and last year's high end, so the kind of devices you expect them to be. And if we look at these numbers again in potentially 6 months, I do suspect that we'll see substantial migration from Android 14 and 15 directly into Android 16. The ecosystem is definitely moving faster than ever, but it still has to overcome that massive inertia of billions of active devices out there. On a lighter note though, looking at this data more deeply, we're actually finally seeing some of those ancient versions start to disappear from the actual distribution charts. Android 4.4 KitKat, yes, Android 4.4 KitKat is now so minuscule in terms of its install base out there that it doesn't even warrant a slice on the pie chart anymore. It's kind of the end of an era for one of the most iconic versions of the OS, but it is a necessary step forward for a much more secure ecosystem. I will say though, this latest snapshot definitely paints a really interesting picture of how Android is in terms of its overall health. Maybe we're no longer in the dark ages of fragmentation where the current version was kind of at 1% or below 5%, but we're not quite at the point of universal parity with iOS either. The push for a 7-year update cycle, I think it's great. It's fantastic to see, but it's only as good as the user's willingness to potentially hit that install button and get it installed on their device, or the availability of those updates. We are seeing a shift where Android is becoming more about the services, Google Play services, Project Mainline, that kind of thing, that an update in the background rather than the big flashy OS number is getting to be a key component. Maybe that's the future, an OS that stays current without the user ever having to think about it. And as I alluded to in a previous video, maybe AI is Google's idea of a new silver bullet, as it were. But for now, I want to hear from you. Are you running Android 16 yet on your phone, or are you waiting for it? Well, as I say, are you happy? Are you one of those happy people, the happy 19% of people out there on Android 15, and you don't necessarily care all that much? Let me know down in the comment sections below. It's a really interesting conversation to have. But cheers for sticking around to the end, and I'll catch you in a bit.